I'd like to welcome you to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. My name is Jenny Browngan, and one of the teaching faculty at the School of Social Work and conference committee member, as well as a former school social worker myself. To help with overall accessibility for everyone, I'll provide a visual description of myself. I'm an older white woman with red hair, wearing glasses, and a brown sweater and beaded necklace. I'm happy you're here today for this breakout presentation, Developing Abolitionist Perspectives in School Social Work. Currently, school social work is even more important than ever, and how we show up for that. I hope today's session will bring opportunities for new ideas and skills and discussion. First, I'd like to share our acknowledgement to the land that we are on before we begin. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin campus resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejope or Four Lakes. We respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk people and the other 11 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you're watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, as was the aim of the boarding schools. This conference aims to bring clarity about the past, but also seek to challenge and inspire us all into action in our work in communities to support Indigenous rights and racial equity. Thank you. A quick note to let people know that the presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website at a later date. And before I introduce our speakers, there's just a few notes about housekeeping on Zoom. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which we will distribute via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted. However, we do have a Q&A feature where you could submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we may not be able to get all of the questions submitted. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters, who include Dr. Brandon Mitchell and Dr. Krystal Folk-Nagua. I'll now hand things over to Brandon and Krystal. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Krystal Folk-Nagua. I am a Black woman. I have locks that are black and red, and I'm wearing a black shirt and a gold necklace. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Brandon Mitchell. I'll pass it over to you.
Greetings, everyone. Good to be here. My name is Brandon Mitchell, and a physical description, tall, able-bodied male. I am in a room that's filled with some jazz art and some abstract art as well, and a cat that's trying to crawl through the bottom of my door from outside. Nice to be here with you all today.
Yes. We're happy to have you today. As Brandon said, I'll say a little bit about myself. I am an adjunct professor at NYU, where I actually helped to create a certificate program for school social workers this year, and currently I'm teaching my course in that program for school social work leadership. And I'm also a board member of SWA, the School Social Work Association of America, and NYSWA, the New York State School Social Work Association. And then Brandon is a faculty member at North Fork State University. So we have our slides here. We have them up. We are getting used to reading from the slides. We've been told, that is how we should be doing things during this session. So please bear with us if you notice the slides are not exactly what we say, just because in our training we've been taught otherwise. But this current slide is our agenda slide. So we just did our introduction, and then when we dive into the presentation, we're going to start with a theoretical background, which will cover the origins of school social work, educational inequalities, exclusionary discipline, school safety, neoliberal, COVID-19 and mental health, education censorship, abolitionist social work practice, and a discussion. While we know we can't have a discussion on mic, we will definitely take your questions when we have time. And of course, we'll end with a conclusion. We kind of did this already, our introductions. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide, pass it over to Brandon to talk about a study that we're going to be doing soon.
Yeah, so this is really the beginning of this work and thinking about abolitionist perspectives in school social work. And with that in mind, we've been working hard, probably over a year now, and have a paper under review. But we're just beginning this work, and we're going to pursue a study that begins in the summer and continues into the fall that interviews school social workers. So if you're interested in getting involved, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get your perspective, and we'd love to improve what this looks like in practice. And we can't do that without folks in the field. We'll also conclude with an opportunity to sign up for recruitment, and you can also reach out to both of us. We'll have our emails provided at the end of this session as well.
Okay. So as Brendan said, we did recently submit a paper for review, and so this presentation goes based off of our paper. And so some of the central theses that we have in that paper is about how punitive and defective-based, culturally oppressive trends continue to dominate the educational landscape. We talk about how these trends and practices and policies are related to educational inequalities, academic exclusion, and hostility towards youth. We also talk about how school social workers are trained in orientation to ethics, equity, and justice, yet our practice most of the time remains to reinforce the status quo and actually keep the inequalities in place. And so our work aims to be action-oriented, provide those types of solution, and work towards abolition of pushing frameworks, justice-oriented, and holistic youth-centered support. So we're going to go through all of that today. So while we can't really have a dialogue, we did want to ask, like, how do we confront racial injustice in schools? So we want you to think about this question. You could put it in the Q&A. We could see the Q&A. We could uplift your answers and definitely be sure to address that. So I'm just going to give a little bit of time to think. How do we confront racial injustice within schools? So these are some of our answers. As y'all continue to put them in the Q&A, Brennan and I say we must attend to the dimensions of the inequalities. So we must recognize the relationship between the historical foundations that created the injustices and then present practices that help to disrupt that. And that's what we mean about like abolitionist practices within school social work specifically. And then we also must establish new methods of practice, right? The things that we've been doing, they haven't been addressing the core of the problem. You can kind of think of it as kind of putting on a Band-Aid on the situation versus really tackling what the issue is. And so this is a quote that I really love and kind of helped me when I first started learning about what it was to be an abolitionist social worker and like working within the schools. And so while this is by Dr. Benita Love, who is a teacher, so she focuses more so on teaching strategies, I say the same can be applied to social work practices. So the quote says, abolitionist teaching is the practice of working in solidarity with communities of color while drawing on the imagination, creativity, refusal, remembering, visionary thinking, healing, rebellious spirit, boldness, determination, and superviveness of abolitionists to eradicate injustice in and outside of schools. So I really use these ideas when I think about what it means for me to be an abolitionist school social worker or abolitionist social worker. And so I invite y'all to think about it like, what does this quote bring up for you? How can this quote help inform your practice, whether you're in schools or outside of schools? And so another question that we have for you to consider and then also answer in the Q&A if you feel called to do so is, how do we apply abolitionist strategies as school social workers?
I think we're a little delayed on these slides moving along, or at least on my end. I don't know if they've. But we're going to dive into the theoretical background and historical context of school social work. And we've got a couple responses in the Q&A and some folks asking if we can kind of just slow down a little bit. So that's a good thing for me to keep in mind as I can move rapidly through these slides with excitement. I want to bring forward a comment from Judy Williams, who mentioned that we have to define what injustice looks like and how it intersects with institutional racial ideologies. And just to begin thinking about kind of the theoretical background and historical context of school social work, I think it's important, as we're all here today, to recognize and acknowledge what's happening all around us in our political landscape. And while we put forward a call for abolition of school social work, it's about the abolition of punitive and punishing and oppressive frameworks. And that this work doesn't need to be political in essence, and that we can do many of these strategies in a way that can unite people around the same kinds of ideas. That it's not radical to be against punitive approaches. That it's not radical to be against deficit-based approaches. It's not radical to strategize on the support for youth and families. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how do we think about addressing the inequities? How do we define what injustice looks like? And how do we build collaboration to target these things together? And so to really define injustice, we have to go back to where the origins have come from and where we are in school social work. And so the movement was founded in the visiting teachers movement, which was really a combination of both an ecological kind of a well-rounded understanding and wanting to link the home and the school and the community to really understand the impact on youth, but also a very deficit-based orientation at the same time. So we see both an attention and a kind of myopic focus on the problems of children. These types of thinking still persist on a very large scale in the school system, which is directly connected to the inequities that we see today in our society. And what we want to put forward over and over again is that youth aren't the problem, and they shouldn't be the target of the intervention. And so as we recognize the origins of the visiting teachers movement, what we see from a report in 1921 is that even in a school system representing the most advanced educational thought, there was still a child who failed to make the prescribed progress or who failed to measure up to the expected standard of behavior. These children were frequently called difficult or problem children. And what I would ask is this any different to how we think and how people talk today about the difficult and the challenges that youth are enduring on a day-to-day basis? And so the origins of school social work, which were connected to kind of the visiting teachers movement, we see were very based around kind of elite, affluent, white, and women were the primary role here. And we still see these kind of demographics upheld today, with the majority of school social workers being white women. Yet at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there were valid aspirations of understanding that we can't understand the behavior or what's happening to individual youth in school without understanding what's happening in the community and also in the home. And so there were both positives and negatives that built the field of school social work up. And at the same time, we have kind of these orientations in psychology and this study of behaviorism, which were really dominant in the early 1900s, but arguably are still active in school systems today, is behaviorism. So the philosophical science of the examination of behavior, which on the surface seems important to understand behavior, right? But what this field began upon was understanding behavior only based upon what's viewable or what's externalized. And what are we missing when we only look at what's externalized of behavior? We're not examining the internal states. And so it was set forth that the only way to understand behavior is based upon what you can see. We see these kinds of thinking still prevalent in the way we operationalize interventions in well-intended frameworks, including social emotional learning, positive behavioral supports, and interventions. And this consistently kind of perpetuates this lack of structural attention in ecological or environmental thinking. And so again, the assumption is that youth are the problem, and then the interventions are targeted towards addressing the problems rather than addressing the structures and the systems that have created the conditions of behavior. And so we have a system that targets pathology, that looks to diagnose rather than understand, and looks at trying to correct and fix rather than operationalize compassion and empathy. Next slide, please. And so with that in mind, it's helpful to get a sense of what the inequities look like in the school system and where they come from. And there's kind of two different kinds that we can think about. And so outcome-based and then discursively shaped. And so these exist with regards to the resources in the school system. These exist as far as the neoliberal shifts in our environment towards market-based ideology, towards privatization. We have academic inequities, we have disciplinary inequities. We're going to talk further about these things. We have a lack of kind of cultural inclusivity. And we know many of these challenges and inequities were further exacerbated by the problems during the pandemic. We have a recent trend around education censorship. But the way in which these things are reinforced is by the way in which we think about the problems. And so youth are thought of as criminals. Youth are thought of as deficient. Youth are thought of around the diagnoses that they've been given based upon a lack of understanding. And so we see a very exclusionary, we see a very surveillance-driven environment as the reform targets further mechanisms of oppression rather than understanding. And so to really understand inequities, we have to think across multiple levels. Next slide, please. So to begin, there's this historical, social, and cultural context that exists. But we have to think about how these things relate to the federal, state, and community levels. And again, what does a school look like? So multiple levels of inequities. And I can explain what this looks like in the following slides. And so if we begin on the US level, we have kind of these parameters of economic disadvantage, impoverished living conditions, health inequities, and then we can bring forward inequities in the criminal justice system. And so we know that there's a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people. This is on the global scale, on the US scale. On the state level, we have inequities, and we could take Wisconsin as an example and look at the percentage of folks that live in poverty. 39% Black families facing economic disadvantage conditions. Health inequities, maternal mortality at 5 times the rate, infant death rates, disproportionality. And then the educational aspects that are also a product of what happens here. So Wisconsin youth exclusion is at 10 times the rate. And so diving in further, we can think about youth inequities, we can think about state inequities, but then there's also the inequities that exist within the school system. Now, the school system reproduces the inequities that we see in society, but it also creates its own inequities. And so we can look at what the resources look like and how there's disproportionality and how schools are funded. That's still, for the most part, related on property values that has not really been updated on a lot of ways. And so what that means is that the affluent districts and neighborhoods benefit from all the resources, while the neighborhoods with less resources are moving in the opposite direction. And so inequities are literally moving in opposite directions at the same time. And so a specific example in Wisconsin schools, you can see that Black students in Fond du Lac districts are 5 times less likely to be in an AP class. And this is one example of where the resources contribute to what the opportunity looks like in the school system. Next slide, please. And so when we put these things kind of collectively together, we see inequities, whether it's academic oriented, disciplinary, or resource deficiencies that kind of combine with these neoliberal movements where any kind of inequity is an opportunity for a corporation to benefit and create privatization. And so at this point, all aspects of the school system are vulnerable to privatization, whether it's the staff or the curriculum or any kind of corporate-based tutoring. And then these things also intertwine with the discourses that we've created, as mentioned earlier. And these things are kind of systematically working together. Next slide, please. And so state and federal disinvestment leads to these inequities, which leads to kind of a neoliberal reform. And so any kind of inequity and the failure of the school system is a justification for corporate-based reform, whether privatization within the school system or a movement to the for-profit educational industry. And we can see these things reflected in the current movement, current political movement to undermine the school system, that any kind of fear, any kind of failure is another avenue for corporate gain. And so if we look further at what these inequities actually look like, let's talk about exclusionary discipline. And an example of kind of the punitive state is really reflected in the ongoing allegiance to kind of a punitive state. So corporal punishment, we see here that in the dark blue, 22 states still allow this kind of punishment in school systems, and that could mean literally direct abuse of youth. And so the prevalence of this looks at some 160,000 youth, disproportionately students with disabilities, and Black youth. If we look further at how these practices are used, we have to begin at early childhood education. And so on the far right of this data shows the overall enrollment in early childhood education. So what we see is that there's 40% white enrollment. We see that there's 17% Black or African American and 29% Hispanic Latino. And then moving into the middle column, we see the rates of suspensions. And so you can compare the enrollment with the overall rates of suspensions. And so what we see is a higher than enrollment prevalence of white youth being excluded by way of suspensions and a higher than enrollment. And we see it nearly doubled for Black youth. Interestingly, we don't see these disparities with regards to early childhood suspension for Hispanic and Latino youth. But we also see a lot of the same patterns for expulsions. And the deeper question is, why are we using these punitive practices at such a young age? Why is there still the fear and not a place where we can learn and teach and have just an opportunity for folks to be there rather than be excluded? And so these are big questions that we need to be looking at further. And the exclusion kind of persists throughout all educational levels. And so it begins as soon as youth are in school systems, and it continues. And roughly 2% experience exclusionary discipline every year, some 800,000 students. These are now disproportionately boys, Black youth, and white youth. And again, it depends on where the location is. So we might see disproportionality in certain districts, but we're not going to see it reflected on a national level. So again, it's important to have an understanding of what that looks like in your region. We see similar trends with regards to the referrals to law enforcement, as the reform to address discipline is again turned to corporate-based mechanisms. And so how did we get here? And there's ideas that there's been increasing rates of violent crime, But more directly, there's been this turn to zero tolerance policies, which really operationalize these kind of punitive approaches, many of which have been overturned and don't exist in many states, but yet they linger on in the presence and the thinking of many folks in the school system. And more recent kind of concerns around school safety also play a major role to how youth are treated and excluded from educational opportunities.
Thanks, Brandon. We did have a question come up. I'm not sure if you want to take it now or
Oh, I
later.
didn't see it.
No, it's all good. It's hard to do it while we present. That asks if you could explain how SEL is behavioralist. Because the understanding of SEL curricular is that they emphasize teaching some of those internal skills versus just external focus like BBIS. So
I think it's a really good question. I may need a few minutes to think about how I can respond to that, and maybe we can pull back in at the end. And I think
yeah.
more directly, the idea was that it's still SEL can still be presented with kind of within a deficit-based orientation, where there's an assumption that there's still skills that youth need to be taught, and that may well be the case. But what many of our points want to argue is that if we address the structures, if we address the inequities and the resource deficiencies, but we need separate interventions to teach youth these skills, or they develop naturally. And so it's just a shift from intervention to a more holistic understanding. And hopefully that offers a little clarity around that perspective.
Also to add, who is saying what behavior is correct, right? Like we're saying that these students need to learn these coping mechanisms, these coping skills, whatever you want to call them, thinking about if you are within schools and most school social workers are on the IEP teams, a lot of the goals that you write are X will learn how to control their outbursts by learning coping skills. How do you learn coping skills? Through SEL curriculum, right? So again, this is like a band-aid to prevent what, or a band-aid used instead of like really getting to the root of the problem. And so something that I always think about and has been confirmed in my experience as a school social worker is that if a student, which is a child, we have to remember this is a human being, is acting out, that means because something is wrong. And so instead of telling them, okay, when you feel like something is wrong, this is how you should act, which is what SEL curriculum reinforces, when you really get to like the root of it, we should kind of see like, hey, like why are you acting out? What is causing you to act this way? And how can we address that issue? So kind of both of those go hand in hand. So I hope that answers your question. And please feel free to continue adding in to the Q&A. I will also uplift. I'm a New Yorker. I talk really fast. Thank you for telling me to slow down. I will definitely slow down now and make sure I speak a little bit calmer and slowly. So thank you for that reminder. Um, so we're going to dive in to talk about school safety. So before we go in, because we did have a moment, I did want to go back, oops, go back one slide and just uplift these again. Like, how do we get to the point that school safety involves what I'm going to talk about next? And again, thinking about the increase of violent crime, the increase of the zero tolerance policies, while they're no longer like state level, they still exist within our schools. Zero tolerance came out of the Columbine shooting, right, as like a way to um, prevent shootings from happening again, which we know unfortunately was not the case. These still happen. And this also leads to school safety concerns. So specifically thinking about school safety, a lot of people consider school resource officers, which they're called in some schools, which are actually part of the police force, right? So right here we're looking at, instead of making the environment, the conditions that the children and the students grew up in more safe, more livable, we're putting police in schools. And we're saying that like if police are in schools, then behaviors will decrease. Um, that is the thinking that is behind why police are in schools right now, or these school resource officers. Um, And so again, some ideas of what it looks like to help reinforce these zero tolerance policies, which do exist, is having locked doors. I know my school, we installed one of those cameras and like buzzers into the door. So students can't just come in and out as they please, right? They have to ring the bell. Other people also have to ring the bell to come in and out. Less windows or windows with like bars around them, or a lot of times there are some like classrooms in the basement, so like there are no windows. Metal detectors, drug sniffing dogs to help kind of like decrease the drug problem within schools. And then there's this idea that youth are focused on as criminals, right? So instead of, again, addressing the core concerns and like seeing what is making the environment that the school is in feel unsafe, we are policing young bodies. And as Brendan had mentioned before, with like the suspensions and the expulsions, that's another form of like policing young bodies and pushing them out. We're saying that like you do not belong here. Right. And so the more that we continue to do this, the more that the schools resemble prisons. And that's why the school to prison pipeline is just so consistent. Like even to this day, like sometimes people think it doesn't happen as often as it does, but it really does. And as Brandon mentioned before, it starts in kindergarten. It starts in sometimes pre-K, that their school safety officers have handcuffed like toddlers for having like impulse control. And when you think about it, they're toddlers. They're supposed to have impulse control. They're young, they're learning. But instead of informing that learning, you're now saying your behaviors are wrong, and now you're going to be handcuffed and possibly put into a police car and pushed into this system one way or another. So the surveillancing of bodies of these young children have like followed them into their schools because they're not safe in their community for whatever reason, and now they're no longer safe in schools. Um, so thinking more about school police specifically, 44% of schools have police in the buildings. So this is 2/3 of high school students who attend school with police presence and kind of get that idea that they're always going to be watched, that they have to, act a certain way around these school safety officers. Yet the evidence for reducing crime and violence and improving safety is unfounded. So there's no actual proof that having police within schools actually prevents anything from happening. And I could give a quick story when I had a student who had ODD have an outburst, which I said we did not need the school safety officer because I was handling it. I was trying to, work with him. But this was the school safety officer was called, and his solution was I could put him in handcuffs. So the child is still having an issue. The school safety officer's solution is instead of addressing what the problem is, I'm just going to put him in handcuffs and we could just take it from here, right? Um, thinking about how school police have been impacted, the Black Lives Matters protests actually did lead to many districts cutting ties with police, at least temporarily. Um, and also, just noting that this varies depending on where the school is located. So enacted the School Safety Act intended for COVID relief, went to hire actually more school safety officers and enhancing security versus focusing on that mental health aspect, which just to uplift, like the mental health aspect was increasing within schools before COVID happened. And then after COVID happened, it just continued to increase. So we do want to just make sure that that is known. And so what do we propose? We propose that strengthening the school safety for Security Act, mandating 2 school safety officers per 500 students. Sorry, not we, but this is what was proposed, or penalized by a way of federal funds. So that means that um, each school has to have 2 school safety officers per 500 students, or they could lose funding, right? So this is another way where schools are kind of required, so to speak, to have school safety officers and police officers within the school because otherwise it can impact their funding, which then, impacts what they have access to. And again, just uplifting that as police, school safety, and schools hardening measures steadily increase, schools shootings are still on the rise, right? So again, these so-called solutions aren't working. Things are still happening within schools. So, in 62% of school shootings have occurred post-Columbine, which was again one of the reasons why we started these zero tolerance policies to help prevent that from happening. And yet, despite these zero tolerance policies being in place, school shootings continue to happen, right? Fourfold increases since the 1970s, and just also noting that school shootings alongside ongoing school safety measures have opened the door to corporate capture and privatization, right? So we're actually going to show you a few different things that have come out of it. So capitalism has been able to increase and capitalize on these shootings. So again, instead of addressing the problem, we're going to provide students with bulletproof backpacks so they know that they could hide behind them, right? Or a bulletproof backpack insert. We're going to make clipboards bulletproof or 3-ring binders bulletproof. And then kind of just show students or young people how to use them to protect their bodies. We're going to create bulletproof classroom desks. And again, bulletproof pencil pouches or hoodies, all these things that come into place that don't actually address the issue of school shootings. And so it doesn't, so while like people are buying these things and capitalism is happening, the issue is still there. It's still a band-aid for the problem that is happening. And just a note for these bulletproof collapsible safe rooms, Alabama School District purchased 2 of these recently, right? So like schools are actually buying into this versus, again, addressing the issue at hand. So we have a lot of these bulletproof handheld shields, window film. I know I said a lot. Gonna take a breath, and I also want y'all to think of some of these questions. Again, if you can answer in the Q&A, that would be great. What do you think about these trends? Like, what is the collective impact on our youth because of these trends? And where can the police are, whoops, and in areas where the police already exist, how can we build partnerships and help to examine their inclusivity and youth experiences, right? Because I do want to make it clear, we're not saying that like all police are bad. What we're saying is that there's no evidence to show that having police in schools actually makes schools safer. So if we are to partner up with police and with other organizations and have these bulletproof items, what else can we do? You know, like we don't want to just stop here, which is what we've been doing recently.
Yeah, and I'd just like to pull up a comment from the Q&A that says, any thought on responding to the pushback of if we get rid of school resource officers, then we'll just have to call community police anyway for citations and or unsafe aggression, which I think is a really good question to pose to us. And I think what Chris was alluding to is that we're not necessarily saying we should be getting rid of these tactics as much as we're saying we're focused on the wrong problems. We're focused on the wrong type of solution to address a problem. So if we continue to see these kind of trends in school system where folks aren't feeling safe, and we aren't getting to the root of why folks aren't feeling safe, and we're just reacting to it with more kind of corporate-based responses, how will that actually address the solution?
Mhm.
And so that means we should be in collaboration with folks, and we should be bringing in different perspectives, and we should be understanding where the money's going too. If we're focused on corporate-based reforms, are we missing other avenues like mental health? And so I think this ties into this kind of neoliberal focus, which really is an extension, really collectively putting forward these types of solutions. And so, and we could just define neoliberalism as kind of market-driven trends in society that kind of privilege privatization and corporations as the potential solution. And even the most well-intended frameworks and school systems are very much oriented around kind of corporate based ideology. And we can see this with the rise of social emotional learning, the use of PBIS in schools, and the use of school police. Next slide, please. So to think further on this, I've kind of been developing this idea of educational capture, where these inequities and this fear and this purported failure of youth in school systems is useful to the ongoing domination of corporations and money making, which diverts our attention to addressing the actual needs of youth. And we saw this during COVID-19 and the framing of the learning loss. And so just 4 months into the pandemic, there was this narrative of learning loss that was all over the media. It was almost as if they had this framework ready for this type of situation to occur. And the initial research was just based on statistical projections. It wasn't actual evidence of learning loss. It was the idea that we think youth will learn less in math and reading based upon what's been happening. And it was designed to evaluate the efficacy of online learning. That never happened. What happened was a new label that labeled youth as learning less in math and reading, while neglecting to understand all of the other avenues of learning that was occurring during the pandemic and what they were dealing with. And rather than understanding the structural aspects of all of this, this research again propagated corporations as the solution to these types of purported challenges. And so we rely on kind of high stakes testing, privatization to these educational consulting groups. And we see it continuing over multiple years. As we see in the next slide, that there's articles that are still coming out about the startling evidence of learning loss. Yet we never try to understand what youth are actually dealing with. And of course, the solutions purported by these kind of corporate-based research is to understand learning loss, which means they need more data. They need to do more testing in school systems. And the testing was mandated by President Biden in the middle of the pandemic. That the solutions are, we need more companies to have kind of corporate-based tutoring schemes. Little attention to pre-existing inequities, little attention to disinvestment in communities and school system, little attention to youth mental health and well-being. And so academic focus at the expense of basic needs. And this we see kind of over and over again. And so the result, again, that we've been alluding to is that youth are framed as the problem, and then they're framed as the target of all of the intervention. And so how do we think about all these aspects of discipline and surveillance and neoliberalism in their effects in your school? And we can continue to think about these aspects as we move into kind of more recent developments with respect to COVID-19 and mental health. Krystal?
Yeah, just wanted to take a second to uplift some of the things that are coming in the Q&A. We have someone who's saying that like we shouldn't partner with the police. It makes students feel less safe in schools, and we shouldn't call police for school discipline either. I think that like this is just the one conversation we're having about what it means to be abolitionist school social workers. Um, on another side, I personally, I agree with that. That's something I agree because I've seen the impact that this has had on my children, my students, and I've seen that it does more harm than good. That's just something we're not really diving into today, but as a like me personally as an abolitionist social worker, I do agree with that statement. Also thinking about like the history of the police comes from like slavery and slave catchers. And so when we think about that and think about like who's targeted by police, both inside and outside of schools, I don't think that should be the case, which also connects to another person who said that school was a safe harbor for some students, not only a place for education, but a place for nourishing meals and social interactions and validations. And this suggests that we need to raise little soldiers who learn to grow afraid of their classmates and their neighborhoods. Yeah, unfortunately, there is this sense of fear, and like when we think about how things are framed, there's this continuing divide amongst people and many different factors, whether it be race, religion, ethnicity, all of these things. And unfortunately, when we have someone who's in power who also continues to like spew those things, and young people who are still learning and trying to understand who they are and like hear these things, they're going to believe it. And so it also kind of like continues to create a divide. Um, there was a question asking if we're going to be discussing truancy. Unfortunately, we only had a certain amount of time, so we're not going to be able to talk about truancy, but that's definitely something that does connect to all of this. And then thinking about school structures can replicate the same structures of the larger society, and policies that disregard youth development and strategies. The question is, what types of micro practices of transformation can occur that is within the control of social workers, teachers, students, and allies? So thank you for who asked that. We will get to that soon, I promise. We're just giving you a little bit more background of the history before we get there. With that being said, going to continue to move forward and talk about COVID-19 and mental health. So again, thinking about how the need for mental health services within schools was already there. When we think about the IEPs, we're saying that a lot of the interventions that are required for these young students, these young people, are mental health services. And so that was happening before COVID-19. We're saying after COVID-19, this continued to increase, right? So we've lived through this. We know that in 2020, it was declared a global pandemic, that 700 million infection rate. Oh, sorry, my dog was by me, a little distracted. And that we had 7 million deaths. We also know that this led to an economic insecurities. We know this led to job loss and then shifting the roles. So crisis-oriented school social work. I was a school social worker before COVID-19, and I was a school social worker after. And yeah, everything was crisis, crisis, crisis. We need to do this, we need to do that. This young person is not stable because they don't have like these mental capacities to do these things, right? Like these are some of the things that are like told to us, not really considering that like this person missed prime social interaction years. So they don't know how to communicate with each other, right? Someone had mentioned like schools used to be a place for social interactions. When we were closed down, if your school was closed down, I know some schools continued. If your school was closed down, and my school was closed down for a year and a half, like that's a long time for various students of all ages because you're missing on those core social interactions. And so we want you to reflect on what was the impact of the pandemic within your community. What do you remember? What could you like recall as some of the changes? Um, and as you do that, just also continuing to say, like, post-pandemic, again, these things were already within schools, but they continued to increase after the pandemic. So there were rising instances of anxiety and depression, suicidality, trauma, and child abuse. Someone also mentioned that schools used to be a safe haven, and if your school was closed down and home is not a safe place, the amount of trauma and child abuse is going to increase, right? Children are going to see or experience more harmful things if that's where they're stuck, unfortunately. And then they are, when we're back in schools, like in the buildings, they're bringing that trauma with them, right? And trauma looks different for each person. But a lot of times there's a lot of like the outbursts, right? And we were trying to figure out why this young person are having some of these outbursts or not acting accordingly, right? It's because of that trauma. They were stuck with it for however long that the schools were closed for. And so just also noting that like pre-pandemic rise in mental health concerns were due to decreased play-based activities. Unfortunately, when there is a lack of funding or a loss of funding, these are the first things that are gone. And as Brendan mentioned, there was a lot of testing that was required, right? So we like altered some money to get the data to do these tests versus having young people just interact with each other, and like art programs are cut and like sport programs are cut, right? And then also rising technology use. We could have a whole session about the impact of social media on our young people, right? Like there's just so much out there. And so having all this like unlimited access to the technology and not knowing how to use it appropriately. And I say appropriately because you could find anything. You could click a button and say you're 18 and get exposed to like everything, right? And so like you're just absorbing all this information and not being able to process it, which also leads to a lot of these diagnoses that we mentioned previously.
Yeah, and I would just add real quickly that in thinking about like the rising technological use, we know that social media really grew since 2012. That's really when Facebook kind of was developed, and we've seen a major shift. And if you look at things like anxiety and depression, all kinds of mental health aspects and suicidality, all of these things have skyrocketed since 2012. And I don't think it's any coincidence that that's directly related to the rise in social media, or I should say directly correlated with the rise in social media use. And so we're going to continue this discussion about the challenges in school systems and inequities that we're seeing with regards to education censorship over the last few years. And just to give you a definition, as kind of constraints on curricula or training imposed by legislators, often related to identity-based policies. Next slide, please. And so for my dissertation, I looked at the impact of censorship across a number of all the policies that were impacted, how it was being framed in the media, what was being talked about at school boards, and then what was the impact on school social work. Next slide, please. And so to give you an overview of what I see the process happening is that we know we have kind of elite structures, this conglomeration of think tanks and legislators and lobbyists, nonprofits working in tandem and cohesion to develop a policy agenda, in this case, education censorship. Now, when we see these policies enacted, this moves into the media to create kind of a bifurcation where there's one narrative on the right and there's another narrative on the left. And then these things are often in opposition with one another, which fuels kind of these social and political divisions that we see in our society. These things infiltrate into the school board meetings, and we see more mechanisms of policy oppression. And then eventually schools are impacted by all of these kind of avenues. And so what are the domains of impact with regards to censorship over the last 3 years? If we go to the next slide, you can see that we've seen DEI bans that began really with an executive order by President Trump many years ago, and then evolved to race and diversity curricula bans, and then sports bans, restrooms bans, bans on gender affirming care targeting trans and gender expansive youth. We've seen these trends evolve to anti-DEI legislation in higher ed. We know that there's new executive orders against DEI that have just come out, and also pushback against SEL. And I know we're getting pushed on time, so I'm going to kind of rip through these slides a little bit quickly. And so to give you an overview, here's what race and diversity curricula bans look like across the states. And we see 47 policies enacted across 20 states. And pay attention to where we see the prevalence of this, where you see the darker shades, kind of in southern regions. And then on the next slide, we see that these evolve to sports bans impacting trans youth in 26 states, again, disproportionately southern states. If we continue, we can see that restroom bans were enacted in 13 states, and this includes things like locker rooms, shower facilities, and restrooms consistent with folks' gender identity. And then on the next slide, we see bans on gender affirming care, 26 states that have enacted these. And again, this is a new executive order against gender affirming care that's been enacted on the federal level. And to continue, we saw anti-DEI movement, which we know that there's new legislation there, so we can kind of push back these slides. And to give you kind of a conglomerate overview, just in the last few years prior to the re-election of Trump, to put these all in context in one visual map, we see that the combination of curricula bans against race and diversity, gender affirming care, sports bans, restroom bans, and anti-DEI laws impacted the vast majority of states. And what I would argue is that even the states that don't have policy have been impacted by the discourse that exists across our society and within the media. And from that, I kind of want to move into school social work, because that's what we're here to talk about, and we haven't done a lot of that just yet. So all of these things that we've talked about impact the role of the school social worker and their wonderful orientation to kind of an ecological home, school, and community environment. But yet there's a major amount of influences on practice. And we can see on the next slide that there's macro, state, and district level influences, all of which we've previously talked about, but to give a little bit more depth, if we look at the next slide, we know that there's a historical underpinnings of the field that we talked to, right? That these things combine with the presence of current inequities in the school system that have been going on over decades on a macro level. And then to build off the macro level, we also see that there's an array of professional guidance for school social workers. We have our standards for school practice by NASW. These standards are in development. They've actually been in development for some time. We also have the practice model from the School Social Work Association of America. These are also in development and will be released, I think, in April. But problematically, these things have been done independently. There is no cohesion between the development of the standards and the development of the model. Meanwhile, we have an accreditation standard that is also very much aligned with NASW and is arguing that a master's level preparation in school social work is sufficient. And what I would ask is that, does a master's in social work give you the tools needed to address inequities in school systems? And to continue on, we see the influences on practice on a state level. And so certification standards are varied. The educational preparation is greatly varied. And then we know very little about what the practicum experience looks like. And then how does training and continuing education meet the needs that we have in school systems? And so just to continue on certification standards on the following slide, we see that in research that I did a couple years ago, I did an analysis of school mental health certification standards, so school counselors, school psych, school social workers, and we see just a drastic difference in the preparation between psych counselors and school social work. And just to bring forward, 15 states don't have any regulations on school social work, which means it's up to the district to decide on what level of educational preparation they can hire school social workers. But beyond that, if there isn't preparation in the state, if there isn't certification standards, it's more likely going to mean that they won't hire a school social worker. Beyond that, you have 32 states that educate at the master's level, only 13 states that have specialization programs. Yet we know very little about what these look like and what the overlap looks like. And again, is there education specific coursework? And our school social workers given the tools to go in and address inequities and work collaboratively and try to really understand the needs of youth in their school system. And so if we see in the next slide, this plays directly into their presence in the school system, that the recommended ratio of 250 students for every school social worker is not met in any state in the country. And we see a huge number of students for every school social worker. Look at the states of Texas, Washington, Oregon, California. And so as we wrap up thinking about the influences on practice, all of this impacts how administrators understand the role. And so when school social workers are in school, they have roles that are highly varied, that are ambiguous, that are unclear to them, unclear to others. And then they have to navigate these very difficult systems that are responding to school crises and a lack of direct school social work supervision, often in competition with other school mental health professionals. And then, as we're noting, increased need in response to what's happening throughout the pandemic. And so I think that's a good avenue to kind of wrap up this section and kind of turn to abolitionist perspectives and the conclusion of kind of some solutions we can think about.
Yeah, and while we start to go to there, just start to think about like, what does school social work look like within your school? Because as Brandon said, it is very varied, right? It's not the same. I know specifically in New York, we have like DOE, the Department of Education, we have charter schools, we have private schools. A social worker can be doing something different at each one of those schools. Even within the same district, school social workers can be doing something different. So we want you to keep in mind, like, what does school social work look like for you as we continue to move forward?
Can I just quickly answer the question from Nicholas that about the lack of data for the student to school social worker ratios in Florida?
Of course.
And so it was a matter of self-report data across states. So if states didn't respond to this inquiry, they didn't report the data. So if they didn't have any data there, it's just because Florida didn't offer that. Thanks for that question.
Awesome. And then to kind of connect it a little bit more into abolitionist social work, I want you to think about ways that you're able to attend to the educational inequities that you see within your school by using justice-informed practice, right? And so that's going to guide us as we talk about our abolitionist social work strategies. Um, Again, if you could kind of just think about like, why do we need these strategies? Why do we need to incorporate some of this abolitionist thinking? And we've already had a lot of good conversations in the chat to why, right? Like students don't feel safe. Schools have changed. I'm looking over here. I have another screen where I have the Q&A up, right? Like school is no longer a safe haven, right? And so these are the reasons why, like Brennan and I agree too, like we need these abolitionist practices as well with all of the history that we have just covered. But it's very important to go through that history so we remember our why, remember why we're doing this. And really it's because like, school social work focused on those individual behaviors without addressing the systemic issues. And as we've gone through, the issues are on various levels and we need to do some work to do that. So we agree that school social workers need to understand that it's not enough to think about the deficit base, the history of like medicalizing students or, excluding trends that happen within schools. And it's important to understand that we have a disproportionate effect on, that all these things have a disproportionate effect on marginalized youth. And so when we really think about the role of a school social worker, we want to uplift going back to our core value, and one of our core values are social justice, right? And so how are we able to incorporate some of those social justice values and skills that we have within to our role, that instead of like reinforcing and maintaining the punitive school systems, we're disrupting it, right? We have to do something about it. Um, and so an introduction to what it looks like into like abolitionist social work practice, just a definition is abolitionist social work practice is a transformative framework aimed at dismantling systems of oppression and creating inequities as alternatives sorry, and creating equitable alternatives. So we're disrupting those inequities, right? And so we're addressing the systemic racism that is within education. We're promoting justice and are reimagining what a supportive school environment can look like. And the biggest guiding principle in this is shifting from that punitive deficit based mindset to being supportive, to being community centered, and making sure that we include the voices of the people that we work with. And so, as school social workers, we work most closely with our students and our families and our communities, right? There was that little diagram that showed that connection. So that's who we should be working with. We shouldn't be confined within the constraints of the school and what they want to do, because at the end of the day, those are our clients. And as social workers, we owe our work to our clients. So thinking about applying some abolitionist praxis within schools, some of the key principles to really think about is centering the experiences and voices of Black students and other oppressed students. We talked a lot about those who are targeted because of their gender before in certain states. We definitely want to uplift their voices too. Anyone that is targeted, that is harmed, we want to get their voices, we want to get their experiences from them and have them share those experiences. And so in doing that, they're able to help us know how to help them, right? And so again, thinking about these SEL, that question that we had before about like, how is it behavioralism? Are students asking for these services? Sometimes yes. But most of the time, I think students and these children are just asking to have some rights, right? Like, I want to be able to go to a bathroom that matches my gender identity, right? I want to be able to come to the school and not feel like a criminal. And so those are the things that we should focus on more so. And in order to do that, we also have to advocate for policy changes that help dismantle some of these discriminatory, sorry, y'all, it's me trying to slow down and talk fast at the same time, discriminatory practices. And how do we do that? So again, we're connecting with our communities. For example, I used to work at a school in the Bronx, and there was a lot of gun violence around there. And so we connected with our council member, and our council member like worked with our school. We did a lot of like awareness about like turning in guns and everything like that without like facing any like charges or anything like that, just to get the guns off the street. We did a lot of work with the communities, and having events within our school so people knew where our school was, right? Um, Again, I have my own ideas about involving the police, but we did have some times where the police were kind of just circling and like making sure that like our young people were safe, right? And so there was conversations with the police about not targeting our young people, right? That's not why you're here. That's not why we're calling you here. We're calling you here because there's a shooting down the block, and we want to make sure that that doesn't harm our students, right? So not 100% where again, me and my personal abolitionist values would like to go, but it's a step in in that direction. And so learning that like this work is hard, it's very challenging, and it's going to take time. It's going to take time, and it's going to take some more of navigating within the systems that we currently work within, right? But it's about how we do it. And of course, developing culturally informing and trauma-informed care. So being mindful of time, we are gonna like have our slides available, so you will be able to get that. But again, some of the key things we want to do. Oh, did I go backwards? Sorry. Okay. So we kind of talked about engaging the stakeholders, right? As social workers, we work with the families, we work with the educators, we work with the community, we work with the students. And so how can we all come together and build alliance and work to fight for racial, gender, whatever justice and education, right? And then also making sure that we have an idea of a long-term vision. And this vision doesn't come from us. It comes from the people who are targeted. It comes from the people who need the support. So we're listening to the families, we're listening to the students, we're listening to the community organizations about what it is that is needed within their school, and we're uplifting that. We're helping use our positional power to do that. Some transformative practices that we could also use within schools, of course, restorative justice as a means to punitive measures, right? So let's restore peace. Let's address the harm that was done versus just punishment, sending punishment out. Um, we're thinking about holistic supports, support systems that are very like beneficial to like mental health. We talked a lot today about how mental health is impacted in one way or another, and also community care, right? While school isn't always a safe haven, sometimes it still is, right? And so we want to make sure that we have that and we're able to provide some of that, some of those ideas like within the community as well. And so, like in an envisioning session, I would say, like, think about some of these questions. What does an equitable anti-racist school look like? Right? And a lot of these slides are talking about race because that's usually what it comes down to at first, right? We start with that and then it kind of goes out. And that's because someone also mentioned in the Q&A that within schools, it mirrors what happens in society. And unfortunately, this is also what's happening in society, right? Another visioning question for you to think about is how can social workers lead in this transformation? What other skills can we bring to the table to do so? So I'm going to put these all out here. But kind of the overview of abolitionist school social work practice is being very strength-based. It's being student-centered, and it's about the importance of building relationships with students, families, and community organizations and other stakeholders that we could get to identify shared goals and priorities. And so we do this work to support development of alternative models of education that prioritize social justice and equity versus being punitive and deficit based. And so some examples of what we could do again is address that harm. So we have restorative justice practices, community schools. We have a lot of different schools that offer different programs, maybe like a pantry or different things like that, or it connects with the community to have a workshop that helps out. Also being culturally responsive when thinking about the curriculum and teaching practices, knowing that there's no such thing as a one size fits all model to help a student get something. Everyone learns differently. Brandon and I learn differently, right? We work together on these slides differently, right? But like we worked together to do it and we have to uplift what we need. And so doing that for our students. And then also just advocating to create a more just and equitable education system as change agents. We're going back again to that social justice value. The core of being a social worker is being a change agent. We're supposed to do something about it. If we see something, we have to do something about it to make sure that it's equitable. And yes, I'm not saying it's easy. It is definitely hard to work within the system, but it's about using like the social work skills that we have to bring things to light, to leadership, to admin, to the powers that be, and show why this is important. Um, and also dismantle oppressive systems. Have this review for you to look at, but I do want to go to an example before we open it up for Q&A. So I had a young student who wrote this letter, right? And she titled it a letter that every teacher, dean, principal, government official, school social worker should read. And she had a lot to say. She had a lot to say, right? And I wish I had more time to like really read it out and let y'all know what she's saying. But some highlights is that, and again, she did this research herself because she was like, why are schools like this? She said Harvard states that emotional health and self-control are recommended for success, right? So this is a student who is asking for support in that. And she's saying, why the heck aren't we taught how to handle stress, bullies, rejection, depression, or anxiety? And we had SEL curriculum in place, but she didn't feel like it was addressing these core values, right? And so thinking about that question that we had previously, what we should have done is talk to her, like what is missing from our SEL curriculum? What do you need to be able to address stress and bullies and rejection and anxiety better? Because what we currently have, it's clear it's not working. So you tell us what we need to add. And then we'll also test it out on some students, like what else do you need? And then she highlights that it's not the teacher's fault that school is like this, that there's this pressure for students to like get the best grades, to always talk within class, raise their hand. I think there was another quote that said, just because you don't raise your hand doesn't mean that you're stupid or you don't know what's going on. Maybe you're just shy and you don't want to talk in class, right? So she's saying it's the educational system's fault that this is what is expected of us, right? So helping to work with her and other students who feel similar to address things like that. Did I miss anything in the Q&A, Brandon, before we open it up?
Yeah, we had a question come forward about the difficulties of really doing this work when you're feeling like you're the only one with this perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good question, but I would encourage everyone to first, this begins by understanding the problem that exists, right? We spent a lot of time talking about the inequities and the problems in the school system, and what this child in the school system was bringing forward is that why are schools like this? This was my question as a youth. It's still my question as an adult. And so I've spent all this time trying to understand why things are the way they are. We have to understand it. And then we have to convey it to others. Because if you understand it, maybe someone thinks about it differently. And that's got to be done through teams. That's got to be done through collaboration, historical attention, working with teachers, working with school mental health professionals, working with families, but listening, incorporating, and uplifting the voices of youth, because we can't do anything unless if we're disconnected from the needs and the perspective of youth in school systems. And so much of what we do disregards youth on a day-to-day basis. And that's the shift that has to happen. It's got to happen on a policy level, and it's got to happen on a discursive level in the way in which we think and talk about these factors. And so, yeah, let's open it up for questions if y'all have any, and really thank you for listening to what we have to say today.
I see a question that says, how do we engage schools to embrace changes in traditional structure, even classroom settings, to embrace such simple things like mandated supporting versus mandated reporting? Yes, that is a big thing too, right? And like I said, if we had endless amount of time, we would cover all of these things. Um, but there is a difference between mandated supporting and mandated reporting. And I think it's because of like, going back to like that slide that Brandon showed that like not everything is standardized between like school social workers across the country. Like it can look different. Some schools have a very strict idea of what it means to be a mandated reporter and other schools don't, right? And so thinking about the traditional thing, it's like if you see a bruise, you have to report it immediately or stuff like that. Um, I think it's more so about being able to like advocate in that moment. So for example, I've had a situation, a little bit different other than the bruising, but it was about sexting, right? So thinking about uh yes, thinking about uh the use of technology and how it became a lot larger, right? And so we had a young student, and her picture was sent out, unfortunately, which usually happens, to various people, right? And so in that moment, it was like, well, you have to report this because uh, she shouldn't be doing this. It's like inadequate supervision of a child. And I was like, she's exploring her sexuality. I'm not going to like call ACS for something that's natural. And of course, like we did go through like the channels and everything like that. But I think it's very about being very firm in those beliefs because they even wanted to suspend her for her picture being sent out. I was like, she sent it to one person who she trusted because this is a possibility now in this age, right? And that person broke her trust and sent it out. And so that's the student who we need to like work on and like really address the harm. But she was a victim, right? Like she didn't ask for this to happen to her. And so I think it's a lot of, like I said, like advocacy in the moment and like being okay with like standing your ground. And I want to be very clear, like I understand that can be very scary, right? Because we never know, especially with like all these executive orders coming out, like if you're going to say something or do something that might like impact your job and stuff like that. And I think that's the challenge of being an abolitionist. If you are really trying to like go down that path, like thinking about like abolition means to put something to an end. And so like we're like you have to like really engage in that. And if something comes back and like does target you, that's unfortunate. And like, I'm not saying you have to be okay with it. I don't want to say like either you're abolitionist or you're not. There's a spectrum, right? So you don't have to be fully like gun ho about it, but like just keeping in mind that keep saying the things. And I think it's very important to learn how to talk to admin. Because I realize that like when you learn the language of admin, they hear you better, and that's like a better thing that like you could do. And it doesn't have to be such an extreme example as mine, but like that's an example I like to bring up because I was very firm in that and made sure that she wasn't suspended or anything like that.
Yeah, and recognizing that what we're doing isn't working. So when we're relying on things like suspension, there's no research to show that it improves behavior. Not only does it not improve behavior, but it excludes youth from the school system, excludes them from educational opportunities, and it's been shown to damage their classmates negatively. And so these are the things that we have to understand and convey to folks to make systemic change.
Well, thank you both. I hate to, I mean, this is like such great conversation. I really appreciate it. And it's something where um, it's so important to learn and understand our history, why we're at where we're at, and then how to make these changes. And appreciate both very much, Brandon and Krystal, joining us today and sharing your knowledge and information. And your contact information is on the slides as well for people to feel free to contact you with any other comments or questions or
Yeah,
community
and
building.
please do,
Yeah.
please reach out.
Mhm.
And so that I think again, the community building is we're really going to need that and need that help and support from each other. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our conference. And please remember to join us right at the top of the hour with Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba at 2 o'clock. You'll also get an email with a link to complete for the conference evaluation overall. And in a few weeks, you will get one with your CEUs. And also remember that just about all of our breakout sessions will be posted as videos on our conference website as soon as we're able to get those all up and posted, and the slides and other information. And thank you again so much for participating in the conference. And thank you for Brandon and Krystal for joining us. And we will hopefully see most of you again at the 2 o'clock plenary session. Thank you.